The mist rolls low across the Welsh hills, curling between oak and heather like smoke from an ancient fire. Dew beads on the grass. Sheep move through the fog like quiet ghosts. And in that stillness, far from the halls of kings, a story begins. It begins, as so many do, with a name almost forgotten. Owen ap Maredudd ap Tudor. To history, he will be remembered simply as Owen Tudor, but in his lifetime, he was little more than a dreamer with nothing to his name. A man born into obscurity, destined for something he could never have imagined. The early 15th century was a world of fractured loyalties. England had just emerged from the glory of Henry V's victories in France. The fields of Agincourt were still red in memory, yet the man who had led that charge, England's shining warrior king, was gone, dead at 36. He left behind an infant son, Henry VI, too young to rule. And so, power shifted, not by destiny, but by hands. Greedy, grasping, unsteady hands. Around the throne, barons schemed. Lords whispered. The kingdom hung in a delicate balance between triumph and ruin. In that chaos, the widow of Henry V found herself alone. Catherine de Valois, Queen of England, daughter of the French king, young, beautiful, and bound by a law written to keep her heart in chains. Parliament had decreed that she could not marry again without the king's consent. And since the king was a child, it meant she was to remain a widow indefinitely, a political relic, preserved but powerless. Imagine her life. The stone walls of Windsor, the endless prayers, the eyes of the court always watching, always judging. And then, somewhere in the midst of that quiet oppression, a Welshman arrived. A servant, a courtier of no noble birth. He moved quietly, with the humility of one who knows his place, and the confidence of one who secretly refuses it. He was said to be tall, dark-haired, and strikingly handsome. Something in his presence drew attention, not in arrogance, but in grace. He was polite, skilled in the customs of court, and possessed a charm that seemed both natural and dangerous. His name, Owen Tudor. There are many versions of how he met the Queen. Some say he tripped and fell into her lap during a dance, causing laughter that softened her heart. Others claim she noticed him while he served wine. A small moment, a flicker of something real in a palace of performance. No matter how it began, what followed was forbidden. They fell in love. Catherine, the widow of England's hero, and Owen, the son of an outlaw. Their love was quiet, a fragile secret in a world where secrets could kill. Some say they married in secret. Others doubt they ever did. What matters is that they shared a bond stronger than law, and that bond gave birth to children, 5 in all, born from affection, defiance, and a belief that even in a kingdom ruled by power, love could still write its own destiny. But love, in those days, was never safe. When Catherine died in 1437, her body was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, a queen's tomb for a queen's heart. Owen, however, was not given peace. The nobleman who had tolerated his presence only because of her protection now struck back. He was arrested and thrown into prison, accused of presumption, of reaching above his station. His sons, Edmund, Jasper, and their brothers, were taken from him. But fate has a strange way of protecting its chosen. The young king, Henry VI, barely a teenager, discovered that the man rotting in a cell was the husband of his mother, and therefore his stepfather. Moved by loyalty or perhaps by sentiment, the boy ordered Owen's release. He restored him to court and granted titles and lands to his half-brothers. Edmund became the Earl of Richmond, and Jasper the Earl of Pembroke. For a time, Owen Tudor's blood mingled with royal favour. The once hunted Welshman now stood at the heart of England's nobility. But destiny rarely gives without taking. When civil war erupted between the houses of Lancaster and York, Owen remained loyal to his stepson, Henry VI, the gentle, saintly king who was more scholar than ruler. Owen led men into battle for the Lancastrian cause. He fought bravely, as he always had, but fortune turned. In the winter of 1461, at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, his army was defeated. Captured, he was brought to Hereford, a grey, wind-swept market town. There, in the public square, he was sentenced to die. The chroniclers record that as the axe was raised, Owen looked out at the crowd and spoke softly. "The head which used to lie in Queen Catherine's lap shall now lie in the executioner's basket." And then, one strike, silence. The blood of the Tudors darkened the stone beneath him. But in death, he gave birth to legend. The Welsh whispered that a red dragon, symbol of their ancient prophecy, had not died with him. It had merely gone into hiding, waiting for the day when one of Owen's descendants would return to claim England itself. And so the story begins, not in triumph, but in tragedy. Not with a coronation, but with a beheading. A servant had loved a queen. A queen had defied her crown. And from that forbidden union, from that fragile spark of defiance, a dynasty would rise that would reshape the world. Westminster in the 1420s was a city wrapped in ceremony. The abbey bells tolled like echoes from heaven. The Thames shimmered silver beneath the winter sun. In the royal apartments, however, the widow of Henry V walked alone. Catherine had once been the glittering prize of a peace treaty, daughter of Charles VI of France, sister to kings, married off to the conqueror of her homeland. But now the conqueror was gone. At 21, she found herself trapped in mourning. Her chambers were heavy with velvet and candle smoke. The portraits of her late husband watched her from gilded frames, his armor polished to mirror brightness, as if he might return at any moment. Yet she knew he would not. Henry V had died of dysentery in France, leaving her a son, barely 9 months old, and a kingdom that looked upon her with suspicion. To Parliament, she was a dangerous woman, young, beautiful, and French. A new marriage might birth a rival claimant to the throne. So the Lords decreed that she should not wed again without royal consent, consent that could not be given until her infant son reached manhood. A sentence of years wrapped politely in law. Thus began her captivity, a queen in all but freedom. Servants came and went, courtiers bowed and whispered. She smiled when she had to, prayed when she must, and endured. Far from Westminster's marble corridors, the mountains of Wales were waking to their own rhythm. Rain on slate roofs, wind through heather, the cry of ravens over crags older than memory. From those mountains came Owen ap Maredudd, ap Tudor, Owen Tudor, to English tongues. His lineage was noble enough among his own people, but counted for little in London. He came south, seeking opportunity, carrying nothing but a soldier's poise and a musician's grace. He found work first in the service of nobles, then within the royal household. Some chroniclers say he became a squire of the chamber, others that he managed the Queen's wardrobe and estates. Whatever his role, he was close enough for her to notice him. He moved with a quiet confidence that drew the eye, neither obsequious nor proud, but sure, like a man who belonged wherever he stood. He had the bearing of a knight without armor, the courtesy of one who knew how words could wound as sharply as blades. At court banquets, he poured wine for bishops and dukes, yet his eyes often wandered toward the high table where Catherine sat, veiled in widow's black. She, in turn, began to linger when he passed. No one knows the moment when their fates intertwined. One story claims a dance in the great hall, the Queen watching from a gallery as servants cleared the floor for a masquerade. Owen, perhaps emboldened by wine, joined in the revelry and, slipping on the polished boards, fell at her feet. The hall laughed. Catherine did not. She leaned down, helped him rise, and smiled. A small thing. Yet history often hinges on such small things. Another tale says she saw him bathing in a fountain courtyard on a summer's day, sunlight on his shoulders, the water scattering like diamonds. Whichever version you prefer, the meaning is the same. She saw not a servant, but a man. And he saw, beyond the crown, a woman who had been lonely far too long. Love in a palace is a dangerous language. There are always ears pressed to doors, always eyes behind arras cloth. And yet, somehow, Owen and Catherine found moments to speak. Perhaps it began with gratitude, a queen thanking her loyal attendant for a service well done. Perhaps with laughter, rare and liberating. What is certain is that they grew close. Letters may have passed between them. Gifts, perhaps, a token ribbon, a silver pin. Catherine began visiting her country estates more often, claiming the need for rest. Owen was always among her escort. On those journeys, free from the suffocating etiquette of Westminster, they walked together through orchards and along riverbanks, talking in the open air. In those moments, she could almost forget she was a queen. By 1429, rumours whispered through the court. The Dowager Queen was enamoured of a Welshman. Some smiled indulgently, others sharpened their knives. To the powerful, the match was not merely scandalous, it was dangerous. If she bore Owen a son, that child could claim royal blood. Perhaps aware of this, they kept their union hidden. There are accounts suggesting they married in secret, possibly before a sympathetic priest. If so, no record survives. What survives instead is the undeniable evidence of their children. Their first son, Edmund, was born around 1430, followed by Jasper and several others. Each birth deepened the risk. Each child was proof of their defiance. Yet even as they built a family, the walls closed in. When Parliament discovered the affair, their outrage was swift. The Queen's Chamberlain was dismissed, her confessor interrogated. Owen fled briefly to Wales but returned. He would not abandon her. For a few more years they lived between fear and joy, raising their sons quietly under the Queen's protection. And then, one winter morning, Catherine fell ill. The sickness came suddenly. Perhaps a tumor, perhaps infection. Whatever its cause, it weakened her quickly. She retreated to Bermondsey Abbey to convalesce, bringing with her a few trusted attendants and her children. There, within stone walls washed by the Thames tide, the great romance of her life faded like candlelight. Owen visited often, though the journey was dangerous. When she died in January 1437, he was at her side. They say he kissed her hand and promised that their sons would know who they were, no matter what the world called them. Then, as the funeral bells tolled across London, He rode away before the sheriffs could arrest him for the crime of loving a queen. He did not escape for long. Agents of the council caught him near Windsor and threw him into Newgate. Chains replaced the Queen's touch. Yet Owen Tudor was no common prisoner. He carried himself with the dignity of one who had once been loved by a queen. When he was brought before the judges, he refused to apologize. "I have wronged no man," he said. "I loved truly." Perhaps that defiance impressed them. Perhaps the young king, Henry VI, intervened. Whatever the reason, he was eventually released. But freedom under a hostile crown is never safe. Owen withdrew to Wales, where his sons were fostered by loyal friends. He lived quietly for years, watching from afar as the boy he had once rocked in his arms, his stepson, King Henry, grew into a gentle, unworldly ruler, surrounded by wolves. Owen could have faded into obscurity. He could have lived out his days as a forgotten relic of scandal. But when civil war erupted, the great conflict we know as the Wars of the Roses, he took up arms for Lancaster, fighting under the banner of his stepson. He was nearly 70 when he led troops at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. The winter morning was bitterly cold, the sky streaked with pale fire. As the armies gathered, a strange halo appeared, 3 suns burning through the frost. Soldiers muttered that it was an omen. Edward of York, their opponent, declared it a sign of divine favor and marched to victory. Owen's men were cut down. He was captured, brought before the Yorkist officers, and sentenced to death. They dragged him to the market square at Hereford. He knelt without fear. Witnesses said he arranged his beard carefully so that it would not be stained by his blood. Then, looking up at the crowd, he spoke softly. "The head that once lay in Queen Catherine's lap shall now lie in the executioner's basket." The axe fell. The crowd gasped. And just like that, the servant's story ended. Yet it was only the beginning of the dynasty that would bear his name. Long after his death, travelers in Hereford claimed to hear the tolling of unseen bells on winter nights, as if marking the hour of his execution. In Wales, poets sang of him as a hero who loved beyond rank and law. And in London, beneath the marble effigy of Queen Catherine, the monks whispered prayers for the soul of the man she had chosen above all others. From their forbidden love came 2 sons who would rise to shape England's future: Edmund Tudor, who would marry Margaret Beaufort, and Jasper Tudor, who would stand as guardian to the child born of that union, a boy named Henry. Through them, Owen and Catherine lived on. Through them, the Red Dragon of Wales would breathe again. The servant and the queen had defied the world. Their love cost them everything, yet it gave birth to a line of kings. And as the centuries turned, England itself would be remade by their descendants. Proof that sometimes, from the quietest corners of history, come the loudest echoes of destiny. In the shadowed corridors of medieval England, power was never born gently. It came screaming into the world, wrapped in pain and prophecy. And in the winter of 1457, within the damp stone walls of Pembroke Castle in Wales, a child was born who would one day wear the crown of England, though few who heard his first cry could have believed it possible. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, was 13 years old. Barely more than a child herself, she lay in a cold chamber overlooking the windswept coast, pale and trembling, her small hands clutching the sheets. The midwives whispered prayers, not just for the infant, but for her life. Childbirth at her age was dangerous. It was an act of courage as much as fate. She had been married off to a man she barely knew, Edmund Tudor, son of the executed Welshman Owen Tudor and the late Queen Catherine de Valois. The match had been arranged not out of love, but out of blood. Margaret carried within her veins the faint, disputed trace of royal lineage, a descendant of the Beaufort family, themselves born of the union between John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and his mistress, Catherine Swynford. Though legitimized by law, the Beauforts were barred from succession. Yet, in an England torn by civil war, even a faint claim could be weaponized. Edmund Tudor was ambitious enough to see it. He was in his 20s, handsome and confident, the half-brother of King Henry VI. But the Wars of the Roses had begun to unravel the kingdom, and before his child could be born, he was captured and killed by Yorkist forces. His young bride was left widowed, pregnant, and utterly alone. So when her son came into the world, there was no husband to hold him, no royal procession to greet him. There was only wind and rain outside the castle walls, and the frail breath of a girl who had nearly died to bring him forth. They named the boy Henry Tudor, after the king who ruled in name but not in strength. Margaret survived the birth, but it changed her forever. She was small and delicate. She would bear no more children. Yet within her burned a fierce devotion that would define her life. To her, Henry was not just a son. He was destiny itself, the living embodiment of every prayer she had whispered, every loss she had endured. The Wars of the Roses raged on. Red and white roses, Lancaster and York, clashed endlessly across the fields of England. The crown passed from head to head, like a cursed relic. Kings fell, pretenders rose, and through it all the boy Henry lived quietly, shuttled from one guardian to another, protected by his uncle Jasper Tudor, who treated him as both heir and hope. Jasper became Henry's shield. Together they fled the shifting tides of war, taking refuge in Pembroke, then Tenby, and finally across the sea in Brittany. There, among foreign lords and wary hosts, Henry grew into manhood, a cautious, watchful soul, molded by exile and silence. He was not the kind of man one expects to seize a crown. He had no battlefield glory, no army, no inheritance. But what he did have was patience, a survivor's patience, the kind that waits while others destroy themselves. In France and Brittany, Henry learned the art of quiet observation. He studied faces, alliances, and the unpredictable tides of fortune. He saw kings fall not from weakness, but from arrogance, and he promised himself he would never make that mistake. Meanwhile, back in England, his mother worked in shadows. Margaret Beaufort became one of the most politically skilled women of her time, pious, intelligent, and unyielding. She cultivated alliances among noble families, even marrying into Yorkist circles to protect her son's claim. Her devotion to Henry was a kind of religion. Every action, every risk, every whispered word at court was for him. The years passed, and Henry remained abroad, a pawn no one could capture. Kings came and went. The gentle Henry VI was deposed, restored, and murdered in the Tower. Edward IV, bold, charismatic, ruthless, took the throne, but his sudden death in 1483 shattered the fragile peace once again. His brother, Richard III, seized power, locking Edward's two sons, the young princes, in the Tower of London. When the boys vanished, the country's faith in Richard vanished with them. In the uncertainty that followed, eyes turned to Brittany, to the last living thread of the House of Lancaster, to the quiet, exiled man with the blood of Owen Tudor and Margaret Beaufort flowing through his veins. Henry Tudor. From across the sea, he had watched England tear itself apart for decades. Now, as Richard's hold on the crown faltered, the exiled prince began to hear whispers carried by the wind. Whispers from his mother, from discontented lords, from those who believed that perhaps, just perhaps, the wheel of fortune might turn one last time. Margaret's letters reached him through merchants and friars. Their words were coded but clear. The realm is weary of tyranny. The time draws near. She had forged alliances with Yorkist nobles who despised Richard, promising them a marriage that would unite both sides of the war, a union between her son Henry and Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of the late Edward IV. It was a plan so audacious, so improbable, that it could only work if destiny itself intervened. And destiny, it seemed, had been waiting for Henry Tudor all along. For nearly 14 years, he had lived as an exile. Now, in the summer of 1485, he began to move. He gathered what support he could, a small force of mercenaries, loyal exiles, and French soldiers lent by the King of France, who saw an opportunity to weaken England's crown. He set sail under the red dragon banner of Wales, a symbol older than the monarchy itself, the emblem of prophecy. But before we march with him, we must linger one last time with the woman who made him possible. Margaret Beaufort, now in her 30s, rose every morning before dawn to pray. Her servants described her as serene, but behind that serenity lay iron. She lived for her son's return. Every decision, every alliance, every breath was dedicated to the idea that God had chosen Henry for a purpose. Some said she was obsessed, and perhaps she was. But it was that obsession, that unwavering faith, that sustained her when others would have yielded. She was a mother in a world of kings, and yet she bent that world to her will. As Henry's ships crossed the Channel, she lit candles in her chapel and knelt before the Virgin, whispering prayers into the silence. She had seen too much death to believe in coincidence. If her son reached England's shores alive, she knew something far greater was guiding him. And on August 1st, 1485, as dawn broke over the coast of Wales, her prayers were answered. A fleet appeared in Milford Haven, small, weather-beaten, but alive with purpose. Henry Tudor had come home. He was no longer the frightened boy she had kissed goodbye years ago. He was lean, cautious, and resolute. His face bore the quiet intensity of a man who had learned to trust in destiny, not chance. In his hand, he carried the symbol of his lineage, a banner depicting the red dragon of Cadwallader, legendary emblem of the ancient Welsh kings. For the people who saw it, that dragon was more than decoration. It was prophecy fulfilled. They believed that one day a prince from Wales would return to unite the realm. Henry marched through the valleys, gathering men as he went. Old soldiers joined him out of loyalty to Jasper Tudor. Farmers and townsmen followed out of hope for peace. By the time he reached the heart of England, his army had swelled to nearly 5,000. And waiting for him, with twice that number, stood King Richard III. The stage was set for Bosworth Field, for the clash that would end a century of blood and begin a new world. But the true miracle of that day would not be found in armor or banners, nor even in victory. It would be found in the quiet persistence of one woman, a mother who refused to let her son's light be extinguished. Margaret Beaufort's faith had carried him across oceans through years of exile and war. Every prayer she whispered, every alliance she wove in secret, had brought him to this moment. As Henry stood on the eve of battle, he was not merely a soldier. He was the culmination of generations, the outlaw's grandson, the Queen's heir, the child of destiny. And in the silence before dawn, perhaps he thought of her, the woman who had risked everything for the dream he now carried. The winds that swept across the fields that night smelled of rain and iron. The banners fluttered softly. Men sharpened their swords, muttering the names of saints. Somewhere, beyond the reach of sound, Margaret Beaufort knelt again, her lips moving in prayer. When morning came, the sun would rise on a kingdom ready to change forever. And as the first light touched the earth, Henry Tudor lifted his gaze toward the horizon, his mother's words echoing in his heart. The time draws near. The summer of 1485 came heavy with mist and memory. In the west, the mountains of Wales stood dark against the sky, their slopes veiled in low cloud. Along the coast, the tide withdrew in long sighs, dragging pebbles like rosary beads across the sand. And through that silence, banners began to rise. They were red and green, the colours of Wales, marked with the ancient dragon of Cadwallader. For the first time in generations, prophecy walked the land. Henry Tudor had returned. He had been in exile since boyhood, a ghost drifting between courts and foreign shores. He had learned the language of patience, of watchfulness, of quiet endurance. Now, at 28, he stood upon his homeland once more, a man forged by absence. His landing at Milford Haven was cautious, almost secretive. He expected betrayal as easily as he expected rain. But the moment his boots touched the wet sand, he knelt, pressed his hand to the earth, and whispered a prayer. For all his caution, Henry Tudor believed deeply in signs. He had come with barely 2,000 men, French soldiers, exiled Englishmen, and a handful of loyal Welsh captains. To claim a kingdom of millions, it was almost nothing. Yet his heart was steady. He knew England was weary. He knew her lords were divided. He knew the people longed for an end to the war that had devoured fathers and sons alike. And so, step by step, through valleys and over moors, he began his march. At first, few joined him. Farmers watched from their doorways, uncertain whether to cheer or hide. Local lords weighed the odds in silence. But Henry was not merely a soldier. He was a symbol, and symbols have a power all their own. In Wales, word spread that the red dragon had risen again. Ancient bards recalled the prophecy, that one day a son of Wales would return to reclaim Britain. And so they came, farmers with scythes, archers with longbows, grey-haired veterans of forgotten battles. They marched not for glory, but for peace. By the time Henry crossed into England, his force had swelled to over 5,000. Behind him rode his uncle Jasper Tudor, silver-haired now but still sharp-eyed, the last living link to Owen Tudor's defiance. Beside Henry marched John de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, a seasoned commander who had fought for Lancaster since before Henry was born. Each step forward brought him closer to destiny, and to Richard III, the man who now wore England's crown. Richard was a soldier king, hardened and feared. He had taken the throne 2 years earlier after the death of his brother, Edward IV, claiming that Edward's sons, the princes in the Tower, were illegitimate. The boys had vanished soon after, and whispers of murder followed him wherever he went. To his supporters, Richard was a reformer, a man who brought order to a chaotic realm. To his enemies, he was a usurper steeped in blood. When news reached him that Henry Tudor had landed, he gathered his forces with ruthless efficiency. Nobles were summoned, oaths were renewed, banners stitched. Within weeks, an army of over 10,000 men stood ready beneath his command. The two forces marched toward one another, through fields heavy with August heat. They met near a small market town in Leicestershire, Bosworth. It was here, amid gentle hills and hedgerows, that the final act of the Wars of the Roses would unfold. On the night before battle, the camps lay silent except for the crackle of fires and the distant rumble of thunder. Henry slept little. He paced the dark, thinking of his mother, of the years spent in exile, of the fragile hope carried on his shoulders. If he failed, there would be no second chance. His bloodline, his cause, and his name would vanish with him. Across the field, Richard slept in a tent surrounded by gilded armor and relics of kingship, the crown, the scepter, the sword of state. He believed himself invincible, chosen by God to rule. But even kings dream uneasily on the eve of fate. Dawn broke pale and uncertain. Mist clung to the low ground, blurring the shapes of men and horses into shifting silhouettes. The air smelled of iron and dew. As Henry's troops formed ranks, he rode among them slowly, his voice calm. "Remember," he said, "we fight not for conquest, but for peace." He was not a warrior by nature, not like Richard, but he carried an aura of quiet purpose that steadied the hearts around him. The red dragon banner rippled above the ranks, bright against the grey. Then, from across the field, came the horns of Richard's army, deep, brazen, and terrible. The ground trembled as armored knights advanced. The battle began. At first, the fighting was chaos, arrows cutting the air, pikes clashing, shouts lost in the din. The sun climbed higher, burning through the mist to reveal a field already littered with the dead. Henry's men, fewer and less experienced, fought fiercely, but risked being overwhelmed. Then, in the distance, a great mass of troops stood unmoving. The forces of Lord Stanley, one of England's most powerful nobles, whose allegiance remained uncertain. Both kings called to him for aid. Stanley did not move. Perhaps he waited to see which way the wind would turn. Perhaps he knew his decision would decide the crown. In the midst of the melee, Richard spotted Henry's standard, the red dragon fluttering beside a small knot of guards. Seizing his chance, he spurred his horse forward. Witnesses later swore he shouted, "Treason! Treason!" as he charged. He cut through the fray like a blade, his armor gleaming, his crown fixed upon his helm. For a moment, it seemed he might end the battle with one stroke. Henry's attendants fell back, startled by the fury of the king's assault. But as Richard neared his prey, Stanley's forces finally moved. They surged down the hill and crashed into his flank. Surrounded, Richard fought on, refusing to retreat. His horse stumbled in the marshy ground, throwing him from the saddle. He rose, sword in hand, slashing wildly. The chroniclers wrote that he killed 12 men before he fell, pierced through the skull. And with that, the battle was done. When the noise faded, when the shouting stopped, the air hung heavy with smoke and silence. Men wandered among the bodies, searching for the living. The crown, Richard's crown, was found lying in the mud beneath a hawthorn bush, its gold dulled by blood and soil. One of Henry's captains lifted it high, its jewels glinting in the pale sun, and placed it upon Henry Tudor's head. The moment was simple, almost unceremonious, a coronation born from chaos. Yet in that quiet gesture, a century of war came to its end. Henry stood still for a long time, the weight of the crown pressing down on him like the weight of destiny itself. He did not smile. He did not raise his sword. He only whispered, "God and our right." The red dragon had conquered the lion. That night, the new king walked the battlefield alone. The wind tugged at his cloak, carrying with it the smell of ash and rain. In the distance, torches flickered as soldiers buried the dead. Richard's body was found stripped and bloodied, his back scarred by wounds. Henry ordered it to be treated with dignity. For all the hatred between them, he understood the danger of vengeance. England had bled enough, and so, with that act of restraint, he began to rule. The days that followed were filled with ritual. At Leicester, Henry was proclaimed Henry VII, King of England. In London, bells rang out for the first time in years without fear of war. The city, weary from decades of shifting crowns, welcomed him not as conqueror, but as deliverer. He moved quickly to secure his throne. He dated his reign from the day before Bosworth, a subtle stroke of genius that made all who had fought against him traitors by law. He promised marriage to Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, uniting the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York into one emblem, the Tudor rose, symbol of reconciliation. It was politics, yes, but it was also poetry. England, divided for a generation, could finally breathe. For Margaret Beaufort, the moment was nothing short of divine. When word reached her that her son had triumphed, she fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Her life's purpose, her endless prayer, had been answered. Her boy, once a fugitive and orphan, was now the ruler of a realm. She called him my king, my son, my life, and from that day onward, she would sign her letters. Margaret R., the king's mother. Henry's path had led from exile to empire, but the shadows of that journey never left him. He would rule with caution, with calculation, with a quiet suspicion that the world could still take everything away. And perhaps he was right. Power, once won, is never truly safe. But for now, the battlefields were silent. The Red Dragon slept peacefully upon England's throne. And somewhere in the soft Welsh night, amid the whisper of wind over stone, the spirit of Owen Tudor, the servant who had once loved a queen, might have smiled. His blood had fulfilled its destiny. The dynasty he dreamed of in whispers had become real. And in the long echo of history, that love, that defiance, that quiet persistence had changed the world forever. When dawn rose over England after Bosworth Field, it rose over a land stunned into silence. The wind that carried the scent of iron and smoke from the battlefield also carried something new, a fragile sense of peace. For 30 bitter years, England had known nothing but war. Red roses and white, brother against brother, cousin against cousin. But on that morning, as the first sunlight touched the wet grass where thousands had died, the storm finally began to fade. The crown, found lying beneath a hawthorn bush, had been placed upon the head of a quiet man, Henry Tudor, now Henry VII of England. He was not the warrior the English were used to, not a dazzling knight like Edward IV, nor a thunderous commander like Henry V. He was careful, watchful, deliberate, and in that caution, England found stability. His first acts as king were not of vengeance, but of repair. He pardoned many of those who had fought against him, choosing reconciliation over wrath. He understood something that few kings before him had grasped, that peace could be more powerful than punishment. But Henry was also a survivor, and survivors never forget the price of their survival. Behind his calm eyes burned a relentless determination to secure what fate had finally given him. He would not let the crown slip from his grasp. And so, from the ashes of war, he began to build a new kingdom. The first step was love, or rather, the appearance of it. True to his promise, Henry married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV. Their union was more than a wedding. It was a symbol, a wound stitched closed. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York fused together into one emblem, the Tudor rose, half red, half white, the mark of unity. The wedding took place in Westminster Abbey in January 1486. The city was cold, the river shrouded in mist, but the bells rang with a joy England had not heard in years. For the first time in a generation, both factions of the war celebrated together. Even the common folk, who had lost sons and fathers to endless bloodshed, came out to cheer. As the new queen walked down the aisle, her golden hair crowned with jewels, Henry watched her with a reserved but genuine admiration. He knew she represented something greater than either of them, the healing of a broken realm. 9 months later, she gave birth to a son. He was named Arthur, after the legendary king who was said to unite all Britain. Henry believed it was a sign, a prophecy reborn. The Tudor dynasty had begun. But peace in England was never absolute. Not everyone accepted the quiet Welshman on the throne. In the north, rumors spread like wildfire that the princes in the Tower were still alive, that Richard III's rightful heirs might yet return. And soon, from Ireland, came the first challenge. A boy appeared, no more than 10 years old, claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, the true heir to the throne. He was, in truth, an impostor named Lambert Simnel, the puppet of ambitious lords who sought to unseat Henry. They crowned him in Dublin Cathedral, draped him in robes, and declared him King of England. Henry, however, didn't panic. He understood men better than he understood battles. He simply smiled, called for his council, and set about turning the rebellion into an opportunity. When Simnel's army invaded England, Henry met them at Stoke Field in 1487. The fighting was fierce, brief, and final. Henry's forces crushed the rebels. Lambert Simnel, the would-be king, was captured. Most rulers would have executed the boy to send a message. Henry did something different. He made him a servant in the royal kitchens. Later, he promoted him to royal falconer, a quiet, contented man who lived out his days serving the king he had once pretended to be. It was not mercy alone that guided Henry. It was strategy. A living example of forgiveness was more powerful than a corpse. But peace never lasts long in a kingdom of whispers. 5 years later, another pretender emerged. Perkin Warbeck, a handsome, silver-tongued man claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the lost princes in the Tower. Warbeck's story was believable, almost elegant. He spoke with charm, moved with princely grace, and carried himself with the self-assurance of someone born to rule. Across Europe, courts welcomed him. France, Burgundy, and Scotland each flirted with the idea of supporting him, not because they believed him, but because he was useful. To them, he was a weapon to keep England uncertain. For nearly a decade, Warbeck haunted Henry's reign like a shadow. He landed in Cornwall, stirred rebellion, and even persuaded the Scottish king to aid him. But Henry was patient. He knew that truth endures longer than rumor. And when Warbeck was finally captured, Henry treated him not as a fallen prince, but as a criminal. He was paraded through the streets of London, questioned and confined in the Tower. Ironically, the very place he had once claimed to escape. There he met another prisoner, the real Earl of Warwick, the same boy Simnel had impersonated years earlier. In time, both were accused of conspiring to escape. Both were executed. It was ruthless. It was necessary. The Red Dragon couldn't afford to sleep with enemies still breathing in its lair. Yet for all his caution, Henry was not a tyrant. He was a builder of systems, of wealth, of legacy. Where past kings had ruled with swords, Henry ruled with ledgers. He reorganized the kingdom's finances, taxed the nobility carefully but thoroughly, and rebuilt the treasury until England was wealthier than it had been in a century. He invested in trade, in infrastructure, in alliances sealed not with blood, but with marriage. His eldest son, Arthur, was betrothed to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. The match was more than diplomatic. It was a promise that England had entered the stage of Europe's great powers. And when Catherine arrived years later, crossing stormy seas to meet her young husband, it seemed the age of glory had returned. The wedding was magnificent, filled with color and song. The young prince and princess represented everything the Tudor dynasty had promised: peace, renewal, continuity. But fate, as always, had other plans. Barely a year into their marriage, Arthur fell ill with fever and died at the age of 15. The kingdom mourned, but none more than Henry and Elizabeth. For all their careful composure, they were parents who had lost a child, and for Henry it was a cruel reminder that destiny never keeps its promises easily. Yet the line would continue. Their second son, Henry, Duke of York, became the new heir, a vibrant, athletic boy with golden hair and fierce eyes. One day, he would become Henry VIII. The story of the Tudors was far from over. As the years passed, Henry VII's court grew quieter, more withdrawn. He aged into a figure of austere dignity, pale, reserved, deliberate. The laughter that once filled his halls dimmed after the death of his beloved Elizabeth in 1503. She had been the light to his restraint, the warmth behind the crown. Without her, he seemed to retreat into himself, into prayer, into planning. He continued to rule England with the same discipline that had carried him from exile to empire. He trusted numbers more than flattery, silence more than speeches. And though his eyes seemed tired, his mind remained sharp, always measuring, always balancing the fragile machinery of the realm. He never forgot the lessons of exile, that loyalty could not be bought with promises, only with proof. And so he watched everyone, even his friends, even his family. It made him feared. It made him secure. By the end of his reign, England was at peace, its coffers full, its nobility subdued. The country that had once bled under a dozen banners now marched under one. The Tudor rose. When Henry VII died in 1509, the bells of Westminster rang not with mourning, but with awe. He had reigned 24 years, longer than any monarch since Edward III, and left behind a kingdom more stable than any in living memory. His funeral procession was solemn, magnificent. Monks in black robes carried candles through streets lined with citizens. The crown rested upon his coffin, its jewels catching the morning light. And as the cortege passed, the people bowed their heads, not just in respect, but in relief. For the first time in a century, they could believe in tomorrow. They buried him beside Elizabeth of York in the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey, a chapel he had commissioned himself, rich with carved angels and stained glass that burned with color even in winter light. Above their shared tomb stone effigies of the king and queen lie hand in hand. Cold marble now, but once warm with life and love. Beneath them, England rests, built upon their union, secured by their will. The servant's grandson had remade the world. And so ended the story of the first Tudor, the exile who became a king, the cautious dreamer who turned prophecy into dynasty. From the Welsh hills to the halls of Westminster, his blood had travelled farther than any legend could have foreseen. His reign was not glorious in the old sense. No shining battles, no chivalric songs. It was quiet, calculating, unyielding. It was the reign of a man who knew how easily everything could be lost. And in that restraint lay his greatness. Henry VII was not the kind of king history loves at first glance. But without him, there would have been no Henry VIII, no Elizabeth I, no golden age of England. He was the foundation, the steady hand beneath the crown, the still heart beneath the storm. And when the chronicles speak of him, they often end with the same simple truth. Here lies Henry, by whom peace was brought to England. In the spring of 1509, London stirred to a new sound. The bells of Westminster rang not in mourning, but in awakening. From the river to the rooftops, their echoes rolled like distant thunder across the city, announcing the dawn of a new reign, the rise of a new age. King Henry VII was dead, and upon the throne now sat his son, a youth of 17, golden-haired, broad-shouldered, and full of restless energy. He was called Henry VIII, and to those who looked upon him, it was as though England itself had been reborn. The old king had been a shadowed figure, careful and calculating, his eyes always measuring the distance between fortune and disaster. But his son was sunlight, exuberant, confident, radiant with the promise of glory. Where Henry VII had walked in silence, his heir would stride in music. Where the father ruled through restraint, the son would rule through spectacle. And yet, beneath the cheers that greeted the young monarch, there lingered something quieter. The deep, steady heartbeat of a kingdom at peace, the legacy of the man who had built it. The Red Dragon had returned not to devour, but to create. Henry VII had taken a kingdom divided by war and given it structure, law, and wealth. He had transformed the monarchy from a battlefield prize into a sacred institution, one that no longer bowed to the feuds of noble families. Before him, England's crown had been a weapon passed between victors. After him, it became something more enduring, a symbol of unity. The Wars of the Roses had left England exhausted, distrustful of grandeur. But Henry's quiet hand had rebuilt its bones. He had turned chaos into order, debt into prosperity, disloyalty into fear, and fear, in time, into loyalty. He had left behind not just gold, but a blueprint, a new way to rule. And though his son would one day destroy nearly everything he built, it was Henry VII who laid the foundation upon which modern England would rise. It began, as it often does, with love. In Westminster Abbey, under the soaring stone vaults of the Lady Chapel that Henry himself had commissioned, the effigies of the first Tudor king and his queen, Elizabeth of York, lay side by side, hands joined in eternal silence. Their tomb glimmered in the candlelight, their faces serene, carved in marble, as if they were still dreaming of the peace they had given their people. Every English monarch since would walk past them. And in that quiet, holy place, the story of their love, a union forged from war and loss, would whisper to all who listened. From suffering comes strength. Outside the abbey, the England they had left behind was changing faster than any could have foreseen. The streets of London were crowded with merchants and traders, the wharves thick with sails from Spain, Flanders, and the Hanseatic ports. New wealth flowed through the city like blood through arteries. The old feudal world, where barons commanded armies and kings begged for loyalty, was fading. In its place, a modern monarchy was taking shape, centralized, efficient, absolute. And with that monarchy came a new idea, that England itself could stand as one. For centuries, the realm had looked outward, to France, to conquest, to the continent. But under the Tudors, England began to look inward. The focus shifted from the ambitions of princes to the soul of the island itself. The rivers, the churches, the language, the law, all began to belong not just to kings, but to the people who lived beneath them. It was subtle, gradual, but unstoppable. The birth of what would one day be called England the nation. Henry VII had understood the value of appearance, of unity wrapped in ritual. He had kept his court disciplined, elegant, restrained, a mirror of his mind. But his son's court would be different. Under the young Henry VIII, the quiet corridors of the old palace would erupt into music and colour. The boy who inherited a peaceful kingdom had no memory of the wars that had forged it. He had grown up amid tapestries and tutors, surrounded by scholars and poets. He had studied Latin, theology, philosophy, the new learning of the Renaissance that swept across Europe like fire through dry grass. In him burned all the promise of the age, the blending of intellect and power, faith and ambition, art and authority. To his people, he was not merely a king. He was the embodiment of a new dawn. But like all dawns, it came with a shadow. The shadow was legacy, the quiet weight of his father's reign. Henry VII had taught England to be cautious, and the people had learned well. They remembered what chaos felt like. They remembered what it meant to have too many kings, too many battles, too many broken promises. They wanted peace, and they trusted the Tudors to give it to them. And so, when the young king began to rule with boldness, they cheered. When he spent lavishly, they admired. When he hunted, jousted, and sang, they rejoiced. For in their minds, the crown was no longer a burden. It was a beacon. But beyond the cheers and tournaments, the true heart of the Tudor story still beat in quieter places. In the devotion of Margaret Beaufort, who lived to see her grandson crowned. In the patience of Jasper Tudor, who died knowing the family line had endured. And in the enduring love of Catherine de Valois and Owen Tudor, whose forbidden union had planted the seed of it all. They were the unseen architects of this new world. Their names may not have been sung in the courts, but their choices echoed through every stone of the kingdom they helped create. In the decades that followed, England would change beyond recognition. The Reformation would tear through its churches. The monasteries that had stood for centuries would crumble under Henry VIII's decree. And yet, beneath all the turmoil, the structure his father built would hold. Henry VII had given England not only stability, but identity. He had taught it to endure, to survive storms, to rebuild after ruin, to believe in the idea of itself. That endurance would carry the Tudors through every trial to come, through the fire and fury of Henry VIII's rule, through the sorrow of Mary's, and into the golden light of Elizabeth's. Every triumph of the later Tudors, every ship that set sail, every poem written, every law passed, every prayer whispered beneath the painted ceilings of the Renaissance, all of it traced its roots back to a single truth: that from love, exile, and silence, a dynasty had been born. And so, as the 16th century dawned, the Red Dragon of Wales no longer prowled in the shadows of prophecy. It stood emblazoned upon the standard of kings, proud and permanent. England had entered a new age, an age of discovery, of intellect, of faith and fire. But deep beneath all the pageantry, in the pulse of the people, in the stones of their churches, in the rhythm of their speech, the legacy of the first Tudor lived on. He had not sought glory. He had not chased conquest. He had sought survival. And in surviving, he had built something greater than empire. He had built endurance. When historians speak of Henry VII, they often call him distant, austere, even cold. And perhaps he was. But when you stand in the Lady Chapel and look upon his tomb, the marble faces of the king and queen resting side by side, you sense something different. You see the quiet triumph of two lives that turned history upon its axis. You see the servant's bloodline crowned. You see the peace that generations had died to find. You see the birth of England as we know it, cautious, creative, unyielding, proud. And if you listen closely, above the whisper of prayers and the rustle of candlelight, you might almost hear the echo of the old Welsh hills, the wind moving through stone, carrying the song of a name once whispered in secrecy, now immortal: Tudor.